Great. Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm Penda Rostovar, Head of Financial Institutions, Impact and Engagement at the Science Based Targets Initiative, and I'm your host today. We are here to help you navigate the recently launched Financial Institutions Net Zero Standard, and our aim is to give you the insights you need to understand its key elements and prepare you for action. A bit of housekeeping. Before we dive into the content, please note that as this is a Zoom webinar, your camera and microphone are automatically switched off. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions when registering. We'll be answering some of those questions later in today's session. If you have additional questions, you will be able to share them through our post-webinar survey, which we'll share towards the end. Your input will help us shape the content of the Financial Institutions Net Zero Standard, including a frequently asked question document, which we aim to publish later this year. Finally, please note that today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on SBTi's YouTube channel in the coming days. We have live translations. This webinar will be conducted in English. This is the second of two sessions today. For this session, we will have live translations available in Spanish and Portuguese. To access the live translations, please select your preferred language by clicking the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. We are also recording the translations and will put them on our SBTi's YouTube channel after today's event. On to our speakers today. We have a delightful lineup. We have Alberto Carrillo Pineda, our Chief Technical Officer at SBTi, Nate Aiden, Head of Financial Standards at SBTi and SBTi stalwart, and Jana Mittenig, who's the Financial Institutions Net Zero Standard project owner. As for our agenda today, we will start with some opening remarks from Alberto. Nate will then provide an overview of the Financial Institutions Net Zero Standard, and Jana will do a deep dive into some of the standard's key criteria. We will then hear more from Nate about setting targets and the standard, and we'll finish with a Q&A session. So let's get started. Please join me in welcoming Alberto Carrillo Pineda, SBTi's Chief Technical Officer.
Thanks a lot, Pendar, and thanks everyone for joining us today. This is a very exciting day for SBTi. The Financial Institutions Net Zero Standard is a result of more than 3 years of work that followed a very robust and very participatory process. The standard was developed with contributions from our expert advisory groups, with feedback from 2 public consultations, and also through pilot testing where we had more than 30 financial institutions that provided feedback to assess the feasibility of the standard. The standard was presented for review and approval by our technical council, and then at the end of the process for adoption by our board of trustees. And so this is a very collaborative effort, and I want to thank everyone who helped shape the standard. Now, this standard has never been more urgent. Earlier this year, the Financial Stability Board warned that climate risks are threatening global financial stability, whether through abrupt changes in policies, technological innovations, consumer preferences, or physical risks. Insurers are reporting surging claims from extreme weather, and the European Central Bank estimates that drought-related risks alone could shrink the GDP in Europe by 15%. Without urgent action, climate-related financial losses could escalate rapidly. The good news is that companies are seeing the business case to take climate action. In our recent trend tracker, the number of companies setting both near-term targets and net zero targets has increased by 227% since 2023. And growth is fastest in Asia, with the number of Chinese companies setting science-based targets increasing by over 200% over the past 18 months. Financial institutions are an important factor in all of this, due to the role that they play in the global economy. Investor engagement is one of the most powerful drivers of corporate climate action. So the investment decisions, engagement, and capital flows, Financial institutions can mobilize capital towards climate critical solutions and deliver real world emission reductions. By decarbonizing their portfolios, financial institutions can also mitigate their climate risks, build resilience, and maintain competitiveness as we transition towards a net zero economy. As a voluntary standard, the financial institutions' net zero standard can help capitalize on these opportunities, giving financial institutions a credible framework for science-based target setting. The standard enables financial institutions to set targets for the net zero alignment on their client portfolios and activities. It helps financial institutions address fossil fuel financing, assess and address deforestation, and improve portfolio transparency and data quality. The standard is intended to complement the SBTi corporate net zero standard and helps financial institutions prioritize where they can have the largest impact. The response to the standard has been very positive. We have over 130 financial institutions across 6 continents that have committed to set targets using the standard. Just last month, LB Finance became the first Sri Lankan financial institution to make this commitment to set targets with the standard. And we hope that many more financial institutions will follow their lead. So if you take one thing away from today, is this. The standard is here, the urgency is here, the business case is here, and the opportunity to lead the net zero transition is here. We invite all of you to familiarize with the standard and to start your net zero journey today. With that, I will hand over to Nate, who will take us through an overview of the standard. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alberto. Now is the time. Imagine this scenario. You work for or with a financial institution that seeks to do its part to stabilize our climate and reach net zero emissions in the next 25 years. This standard is for you. Before we delve into the criteria and resources that comprise the standard, I'll describe how it fits into the Science-Based Targets Initiative and some of its innovative aspects. For those of you new to us, the Science-Based Targets Initiative was founded 10 years ago to support private sector climate action in line with the Paris Agreement. It's a corporate climate action organization that enables companies and financial institutions worldwide to play their part in combating the climate crisis. As Alberto mentioned, we develop voluntary standards, tools, and guidance for financial institutions and companies. We are not a membership organization. Our standards, tools, and guidance are open for your companies and financial institutions to use globally. Let's start with how this standard fits into SBTi's overall standard setting framework. At the Science-Based Targets Initiative, we have 2 main standards: the financial institutions net zero standard that we're presenting here today, and the corporate net zero standard, which was first launched in 2021 and is now being updated to its 2nd version. As you can see here, the 2 standards are intended to complement each other, where the corporate net zero standard covers Scope 1 and 2 emissions, as well as Scope 3 emissions, category 1 through 14, while the financial institutions net zero standard covers Scope 3 emissions, category 15. The intention is that these 2 standards work together to cover all of the entities related emissions. The standards are supported by a set of target setting methods and pathways, which the initiative is constantly updating. And it's also supported by a group of sector-specific standards, for example, covering emissions-intensive sectors such as electricity, cement, and steel production. The next slide goes into some of our objectives in creating this new standard. So the first objective was for SBTi to create its first net zero standard for financial institutions. Back in 2020, we published our near-term framework for financial institutions, which serves as the basis for the 170 existing financial institution science-based targets, which are published on our website. We have updated that framework and learned from the past 5 years and incorporated that into this new net zero standard for financial institutions. The second basic objective here is to facilitate scale up of financial institutions' climate ambitions, particularly their activities focused on aligned activities, investments, and assets. And so this alignment orientation is one of the major innovations of the financial institutions net zero standard, which is also being explored with the corporate net zero standard. One of the functions of the alignment targets is to bring non-emissions metrics into the science-based targets and initiative. A third objective is that the initiative steps back here a little bit and covers the entire net zero journey of financial institutions, from commitment to assessment, target setting, reporting, renewal of the target, and claims related to the target. Finally, in addition to building on the learning from the near-term framework, the financial institutions net zero standard seeks to improve interoperability both internally with the corporate net zero standard, but also externally with our peer initiatives. And so we'll talk through some of the ways that we do that in the standard. This figure zeroes in on that second component of alignment targets that I mentioned. Historically, SBTi has been focused on emission reduction targets. And the way that we initially structured the targets was that the target setting entity would have a historical emissions baseline, and then they would reduce emissions from that historical emissions baseline. That's captured in this figure with the bars and the gray dotted line on the left. That's still essential, but in order to promote increased real economy reductions and engagement, the financial institutions net zero standard uses portfolio climate alignment as its leading metric and as the framing for these targets. So you can see that with the red line here. And the idea is that the financial institutions with net zero targets increase the portion of their aligned activities over time, such that eventually they have full coverage of activities that are either in transition or providing climate solutions. So we will describe how financial institutions can understand what's in which category as part of this presentation. A couple of other things to note here is that a major challenge for financial institutions in particular is around Scope 3 data. And so we've captured this challenge with what you can see are the whiskers on the left side of the chart. And the idea is that financial institutions should not be prevented from setting targets by not having comprehensive primary data. We provide resources so that the financial institutions can start with what they have and the data that are available to begin the process and improve the data coverage and quality over the duration of the target. The last thing to note here is that with this standard, we are adding a North Star, as we call it, which is the definition of what net zero looks like for the financial institutions in terms of that endpoint of what they've actually achieved. The next slide focuses on another new component of this standard, which is the coverage. So first, we begin with the definition of a financial institution, which is any entity which derives at least 5% of its revenue from any of these 5 activities. Those of you who have followed the Science-Based Targets Initiative's work with financial institutions and their near-term framework may recall that that framework covers investment and lending activities. With the financial institutions net zero standard, we have added insurance underwriting and capital markets activities. So in this case, if a financial institution engages in both lending and asset management, for example, and each of those activities generates more than 5% of their revenue, that financial institution will have to use the financial institutions net zero standard to set targets for both activities. The standard covers a broad range of activities and is applicable to a diverse range of financial institutions all over the world. It's intended to be used by commercially operated private and public financial institutions globally. With that, I will conclude the overview of this, and now I will hand you over to Jana, who will go through some of the specific criteria in the standard. Over to you, Jana.
Thank you so much, Nate. And hello, everyone. Glad to have you with us. Let's dive right into the criteria that make up the financial institutions net zero standard. Starting with a high-level overview. Within the standard, the net zero process is broken down into 5 stages, corresponding with our 5 chapters. These stages contain 19 criteria in total, and 16 are relevant for initial validation. 3 apply for targets that are revalidated, either at the end of the near-term target cycle, which is up to 5 years, or at the net zero target year, which is 2050 at the latest. The first stage, detailed in Chapter 1, has 4 criteria. The first criteria are a public commitment to net zero by 2050, followed by defining the organizational and portfolio boundaries, along with a supporting governance structure. The journey then continues through Chapter 2, which contains a base year assessment, including base year selection, the greenhouse gas inventory, a climate alignment assessment, and additional exposure assessments relating to clean energy to fossil and deforestation exposure. We'll explain each of these terms later in the presentation. Next, financial institutions develop and set policies and targets on their financial activities as part of the target setting stage here in Chapter 3. This chapter defines the requirements to publish policies and engagement plans to address fossil fuel, deforestation, and optionally real estate activities. It also includes 3 criteria on target setting, covering non-portfolio and portfolio near and long-term targets. Also, it defines what financial institutions must do to be classified as reaching a net zero end state. Eventually, it closes with criteria on how to communicate targets and policies, as well as a target recalculation specification. Chapter 4 lists reporting requirements and establishes the target renewal components. And lastly, Chapter 5 describes the claims that can be made when following this standard. Those 5 chapters are supported by 6 reference tables to help apply the criteria. These tables include a segmentation of financial activities, a list of emission-intensive sectors and their respective value chains, and details on target setting. Let's now dive into some of the criteria that many of you have been asking about since the launch of the standard. You can see them here now on the screen. And I'll start that on the next slide with criterion number 3 in Chapter 1, which focuses on the portfolio boundary. As Nate has already mentioned, financial institutions must apply the financial institutions net zero standard to all financial activities that generate 5% or more of their total revenue. Next, these activities need to be categorized into 4 segments as per tables 1.1 to 1.5 in the standard. Those tables focus on asset classes and lines of business, and there's 1 table per financial activity. So that's how you come up to those 5. Those tables are then combined with a sector split, with segment A covering the fossil fuel sector, segment B covering certain financial activities in other emission-intensive sectors, such as transport, energy, or the real estate sector. All of the sectors are listed in Table 2 in the standard. Segment C covers certain financial activities in other sectors that are not listed in A or B. And then lastly, Segment D covers the remaining subset of activities in both emission-intensive sectors as well as other sectors. This segmentation is really a key part of the standard and establishing portfolio boundaries and target setting, as well as establishing a prioritization of action for financial institutions. I'll move on to Chapter 2 now and focus on the new component that Nate showed you on the slide with the red line, which is the climate alignment. It's criterion number 7 in the standard. This criterion requires financial institutions to assess the climate alignment status of their financial activities. As already mentioned, a really important part of the standard. By climate alignment, we mean the share of in-scope financial exposure that falls under 3 categories. Number 1, in transition. Number 2, climate solutions. Or 3, a net zero state. For a definition, you can refer to Table 4.2 in the standard that delivers more granular definitions of these categories for different portfolio companies and assets. On the right side of the slide, you see another innovation in the standard, which contains that financial institutions can use eligible third-party climate alignment methodologies to assess the climate alignment of their counterparties. These methodologies are listed in the SBTi implementation list, the second document that we published alongside the standard. Alternatively, financial institutions can also compare their counterparties to sector reference pathways in a benchmark divergence assessment to see if, for example, their emissions intensity is lower than the relevant sector pathway. So 2 options for that assessment. I'll continue with chapter 3 and focus now on the fossil fuel transition policy and fossil fuel targets. Starting on the left side of that slide with criterion 9, which is about the fossil fuel transition policy. Because of the sector's climate impact and its transitional role, fossil fuel-related financial activities must meet both policy and target requirements. The transition policy here on the left side has 3 main elements that cover new financial activities. First, there must be no new financial activities for projects or companies involved in new coal expansion. Second, no new financial activities for projects involved in new oil and gas expansion after the policy publication date. And third, no new general purpose financial activities for companies involved in new oil and gas expansion that would require a final investment decision after 2030. Item number 3 here contains a recommendation for immediate cessation. Moving to the right side, you can see the fossil fuel targets, which cover both the new and existing financial activities. For the coal sector, phase-out targets are required, with a timeline of 2030 in OECD countries and 2040 in non-OECD countries. That's the OECD, non-OECD split is defined per headquarter of the respective entity, project, or asset. Moving on to oil and gas. For the oil and gas sector, financial institutions are required to select alignment or sector targets. For alignment targets, at least 95% of alignment is required in developed economies and at least 85% in developing economies by 2035. The 2035 is earlier than the 2040 timeline required for other emission-intensive sectors. You'll see that in a second when I talk about all other targets. Zooming into the definition for what in transition means for an oil and gas company, it includes 2 components. One, that oil and gas companies would need to set absolute emission reduction targets consistent with the IEA, International Energy Agency's net zero emissions pathway, and 2, cannot be involved in fossil fuel expansion after 2030. The second choice that financial institutions have for setting oil and gas targets are sector targets. In this instance, the financial institution needs to aggregate the emissions from its oil and gas counterparties and set absolute emission reduction targets on these emissions, once again in line with the IEA's net zero scenario by 2050. So what you can see here is that fossil fuel transition policy and targets work in combination, aiming to push for a fossil fuel transition from a financing perspective. This complements the corporate net zero standard and sector standards, which focus on driving the transition on the demand side. I'll move on now to 2 criteria addressing deforestation. Criterion 8 focuses on the first step, exposure assessment. Financial institutions must publish their deforestation exposure by 2030 and then annually after after that initial exposure, they have to disclose the exposure on an annual basis. Within the standard, deforestation exposure is defined as the amount of in-scope activities provided to portfolio entities that are linked to, at a minimum, the loss of natural forests stemming from involvement with beef, palm oil, soy, cocoa, and timber and wood fiber. Based on this step 1, the exposure assessment, if significant deforestation exposure is identified, the next step, as outlined in criterion number 10, is that financial institutions are required to publish an engagement plan by their next target validation. This plan is including their strategy and timeline of actions to address deforestation in their portfolios. They are also required to publicly disclose progress on this plan. The last relevant component is that financial institutions will need to provide their definition of significant exposure as part of the exposure assessment and may, for example, use the high deforestation exposure or high financial materiality thresholds in the Forest IQ methodology. Move on to the targets section now, highlighting two criteria on the next two slides. Both will focus on portfolio targets. Under the standard, financial institutions must set both near and long-term targets, over time increasing their coverage of in-scope financial activities. Criterion 12, which you see here on the slide, addresses near-term targets. Financial institutions have the option to set either portfolio climate alignment or sector targets. The climate alignment metric is the percentage of total in-scope financial exposure that is categorized as in transition, a climate solution, or net zero state. The sector metric, on the other hand, includes physical emissions intensity, technology share, and absolute emissions, depending on the sector that the target is for. The level of ambition that is required by the standard depends on the range of different factors, including segmentation of financial activities, those segments A, B, C, and D that I've walked you through in the beginning under criterion number 3. To give you an example, for climate alignment targets, a linear increase of climate-aligned financial activities to 95 in developed economies and 85 in developing economies is required by 2035 for segment A, 2040 for segments B and C, and by 2050 for segment D. Different milestone years by segment guide financial institutions to prioritize action on the most relevant portfolio activities first. Meanwhile, the ambition of sector targets depends on the pathways provided by the accompanying target setting tool that you can also find on the homepage. In terms of target timeframe on coverage that you see on the right side, the timeframe for near-term targets is up to 5 years, and the target coverage includes a minimum of 67% of all 4 segments, with 100% coverage being required for segments A, B, and C. The next slide shows you criterion number 13, which covers long-term portfolio targets. Here, for long-term portfolio targets, only climate alignment targets can be set. Financial institutions must aim for at least 95% of their exposure to counterparties at a net zero state. So the third of the 3 definition components of climate alignment. And they have to achieve that 95% by their selected net zero year, which would need to be 2050 at the latest. The coverage requirement is 100%. So essentially all 4 segments A, B, C, and D. So that was a brief overview of some of the key criteria that we have in the standard. I'll now hand you back to Nate to walk you through some final elements of setting targets before we conclude the webinar with a Q&A session.
Thank you, Jana. Great overview of the criteria and lots of details for all of the attendees here to absorb. So we're conscious that it's a lot of information. So really our goal here is to convey the standard such that you understand it and are able to set targets and submit them to SBTi to have them validated. So back in July of this year, we published 2 key documents, which are illustrated in the thumbnails here on the left side of the slide. The first is the standard itself, which is approximately 80 pages and is really, at the end of the day, a list of criteria that the financial institutions can use for developing their targets and that we use in SBTi for validating those targets. One of the big changes, as Jana mentioned, in the FIN standard is the introduction of this implementation list, which is a resource that SBTi has published for the first time that identifies eligible third-party methods that financial institutions and other stakeholders may use for determining alignment. This implementation list also includes country and regional taxonomies, which may be used to define climate solutions. This is a big innovation for SBTi, and marks a very new approach for the initiative. Aside from these two key documents, we've also published a suite of explanatory documents and materials for target submission. I'll just highlight a few of them here in this slide. So one is the basis for conclusions report for any of you that wants to dig a bit deeper. What we've done in the basis for conclusions report is to summarize the feedback that we heard from all of you during the first two public consultation rounds. So we had two public consultation rounds. We also had pilot testing with dozens of financial institutions. And what we've done in the basis for conclusions report is to explain what we heard and how we responded to that feedback and how that has supported the revisions that we made to the standard. Another document is the protocol, which explains how we developed the implementation list and how we'll be updating it going forward. In terms of the materials for target submission by financial institutions and any consultants or others helping the financial institutions, a key document here is the submission form itself, which is a rather extensive spreadsheet that is to be filled out by the financial institution. The criteria assessment indicators is our name for the explanation for how our target validation team uses the standard to assess what is included in the submission form. So it makes it very tangible. We also have some supporting materials that may be useful for financial institutions and their stakeholders, including a target settings tool that's a spreadsheet tool. We also have a document that describes the methods and the components of that target setting tool. And finally, there's a fossil fuel policy template to explain what the language can look like for financial institutions publishing their fossil fuel policies as part of their financial institutions net zero standard. All of these materials are available on the Science Based Targets Initiative website. And as we update the materials, we invite all of you to join our mailing list to make sure that you're receiving the most recent materials and any new additions. The next slide just gives an overview of the options for financial institutions. So at this point, we have two resources for financial institutions. There's the standard, which we're talking about here today, and there's the near-term criteria, which were, again, initially published in 2020, and then were updated last year. The 170 financial institutions that have validated science-based targets use the near-term framework, and those remain valid for the duration of those science-based targets. For the 130 financial institutions that have public commitments to using this new financial institutions net zero standard for setting their own net zero targets with SBTi, they have 24 months from the publication of the standard. So they have until July of 2027. For financial institutions that don't have any existing targets or commitments, there's an open choice period through next calendar year, so through December 31st of 2026, during which you may choose between the previous near-term criteria or this new net zero standard. As Alberto mentioned, this standard is the culmination of more than 3 years of research and deliberative work by SBTi and our supporting groups and advisors. However, in addition to being the end of that period, it's also the start of a new period for us of monitoring, evaluation, and learning, where the Science Based Targets Initiative will be collecting data to see how financial institutions are using these new metrics and new approaches and how they compare with our previous emissions-based approaches. With that, I will pause and hand this back to Pendar to bring us into the Q&A section of this webinar.
Thank you very much, Nate, and thank you very much, Jana, for that overview of the standard and target setting with the standard. I would now like to begin our Q&A session and thank everybody again who submitted their questions when registering for the webinar. So the first question, We have touched on it already a little bit, but it would be of some merit to go into a little bit detail as to why is the standard focusing on climate alignment as the leading indicator. Nate?
Thank you, Pendar. And this is a great question that's central to both the financial institution's net zero standard and where SBTi is going. The key objective of the Science-Based Targets Initiative is to support real-world emission reductions, both in the financial institution's net zero standard and across all of our standards and products. As such, our focus here is on financing reduced emissions and not just reducing financed emissions. To note, by financed emissions, what I mean is including all 5 financial activity types covered in the standard: lending, asset owner investing, asset manager investing, insurance underwriting, and capital markets. There are 3 main reasons for taking this approach. First, as financial institutions target an increase in the share of climate-aligned financial activities, we should see a growing number of portfolio companies and assets implementing credible transition plans and decarbonizing in line with what is needed to achieve net zero by 2050. Second, engaging companies and assets in emissions-intensive sectors to transition, as well as scaling up climate solutions, are crucial to the economy-wide net zero transition. What we've observed is that even financial institutions that aren't necessarily using SBTi to set their own targets are using SBTi to future-proof their portfolios and to prepare for transition risk. Doing these 2 things, however, can actually result in near-term increases of financial institutions' portfolio emissions. Targeting an increase in the share of climate-aligned financial activities helps to incentivize pursuing both of these levers in terms of emission reductions and engagement. The third reason is changes in portfolio emissions may be driven by factors other than real-world emission reductions. For example, a change in the amount of financing provided to a portfolio company, the valuation of the company, or the composition of companies in the portfolio can all affect total portfolio financed emissions. Nevertheless, portfolio emissions are a useful and important indicator. As the share of climate-aligned activities increases, the concept is that emissions reductions should follow as a lagging metric, capturing the impact of the alignment actions taken. In short, the standard turns ambition into alignment and alignment into action. Back to you, Pendar.
All right. Thank you very much indeed, Nate. Second question is, and for this one, I'm going to go to Jana. Can you provide an example of what the standard means for different financial institutions? For example, a bank or an asset owner or an asset manager or private equity firm, in order to bring the standard alive?
Thank you, Pendar. That's a good question, and might I say, a slightly complex one. It has lots of nuance, so I'll use some slides to walk our listeners through. As you might recall from the presentation, a financial institution would first need to categorize its financial activities as in and or out of scope, and next zoom in on the in scope and conduct a further categorization into 4 segments, A, B, C, and D. And the slide you'll see now does exactly that for a hypothetical financial institution that only has lending activities as in scope. The total lending activities in the bottom left are $50 or $50 million. And as you can see, $40 are in scope across the 4 segments. From top to bottom, you see the segments A to D, and you can see that financial exposure is $10 to the fossil fuel sector in the segment A. In some, there's also $10 to segment B, other emission-intensive sectors. So you can see here project finance to power or a loan to air transport as examples. $10 also to other sectors which fall under segment C. And you can see $10 of mortgage and SME loans which fall under segment D. If you move now to the middle of the slide, we'll start with near-term targets and start also then with near-term target coverage. The coverage needs to be 100% of segments A, B, and C. So that's the 75 you see here with the arrow. Those need to be covered by targets. If you recall, the near-term target coverage needs to be 67% of all 4 segments. This means that for this hypothetical financial institution, where we have segment D covering 25% of the overall in scope, that segment D is optional for the financial institution. So the financial institution can decide whether they want to set near-term targets for their mortgage and SME loans. If we move on to target types, you can see that for near-term targets, the financial institution can select either climate alignment or sector targets for most of these sectors, except for coal, where a phase-out target must be set. For sector targets, so the second column as part of the near-term targets, you can see that an absolute emission reduction target would be needed for the oil and gas sector. A physical emission intensity can be used across the other sectors in segment B. And there's one option to choose a technology share metric for the power generation sector. So that's what you can have for sector targets. The minimum ambition for those sector targets would then be corresponding to the sector pathways that you find in the target tool, which is published on the SBTi website. If we now go to alignment targets, if you recall, the minimum ambition for alignment targets depends on the segment. So that's why you do see different numbers for segments A compared to B and C. For A, it is a linear increase here on the slide in this example to 95% for developing economies by 2035. And then the 2030 target corresponds to a linear increase for the target year of 2030. For segments B and C, that linear increase is to be calculated by reaching 95% for developing economies by 2040. And for segment D, it would be 2050. The time frame for near-term targets is up to 5 years. So here we've chosen a target year of 2030 and a base year of 2025. The last column on the slide is long-term targets. Here it's easier. At least 95% of financial exposure needs to be to counterparties that are at a net zero state by 2050. And it needs to cover all 4 segments. So 100% of the of those four segments. And to wrap that slide up, action is prioritized for most climate relevant activities with the different ambition levels. Next, let me compare the lending example to the other financial institutions that we have as part of the standard. Because it's also roughly applicable, and I'll walk you through some of the differences now. For insurers, a key difference is that all personal lines are out of scope, whereas for banks, some consumer loan categories are part of segment D. For asset owners and managers, as you can see here on the right side of the slide, the key difference is the categorization of asset classes, particularly in segment D, so the red-colored part on the slide. The full details you can find in tables 1.1 to 1.5 of the standard, but we have some examples here to highlight the differences between lending and asset owner and manager investing. So you can see that investments via fund of funds, private equity investments under a certain ownership threshold of 25%, or without a board seat are covered as part of segment D. Another example is that investments managed through advisory mandates for asset managers are also part of that segment D. On a separate note, for asset owners with in-scope investments managed through asset managers with discretionary mandates, climate alignment can be measured based on either the underlying companies and assets or the asset manager. To make that sentence come into life, let me give you an example. If an asset owner uses 2 asset managers with discretionary mandates for all of their investments, and those investments cover 10 companies, Then the asset owner's climate alignment can either be measured based on the 10 companies or based on the 2 asset managers. Similarly, if we now move to the asset manager, asset managers managing in-scope investments on behalf of asset owners through advisory mandates, climate alignment can be measured based on either the underlying companies and assets or the asset owner giving the investment mandate. Pendar, I've finished. Back to you.
All right. Thank you very much indeed. That was a very good answer, and things really do come alive when you give an example. Question 3, on this one, I'm going to go to you, Nate, and this is a question that we get asked a lot when we engage with financial institutions in emerging markets, and that is, how does the standard treat regional differences?
Thank you, Pendar. And indeed, this is a central question for combating climate broadly, and obviously something that's been a challenge for the IPCC for decades now. The Fin standard is, again, a big leap for the Science-Based Targets Initiative in the sense that in the beginning of the initiative, we were completely global. We had 0 regional differentiation. Everything was global pathways with the idea that this was straightforward and easy to understand. But again, with this standard, we are introducing more regional differentiation than any previous SBTi standard. Here are 4 examples of how regional differences are incorporated within the financial institutions net zero standard. First, financial institutions can separate near-term climate alignment targets for developed and developing economies that allow for a more gradual increase in climate alignment in developing economies. As Jana mentioned, for alignment targets, financial institutions must aim for at least 95% of their financial activities in segments B and C in developed economies to be climate aligned by 2040, compared to at least 85% in developing economies by 2040. Second example is the implementation list, which allows the use of regional taxonomies to evaluate whether financial institutions' activities can be considered to be dedicated to climate solutions. Third, financial institutions are expected to set separate phase-out targets for the coal sector, as Jana mentioned, with later phase-out year for non-OECD countries than for those that are in OECD countries. Finally, fourth, for those with significant real estate emissions, which is most financial institutions at this point, near-term sector targets for the building sector use numerous pathways that are both geographically and building specific. This is based on our new building standard, which has many, many pathways that are very granular. To step back and respond to your question, Pendar, one of our desired outcomes of the standard is that it helps to drive additional emerging market transition finance.
Great. Thank you very much, Nate, for that. And then for the next question, if it's okay, I'm going to stay with you. What are the differences between the financial institutions' near-term criteria and the financial institutions' net zero standard? And is it possible to set only near-term targets under the net zero standard?
Thank you, Pendar. It's a good question, and it's one that we get often, especially since the acronyms for the 2 standards are quite close. So the near term is financial institutions near term, which is FINT, F-I-N-T, and this new standard is FINZ, which is F-I-N-Z. But a lot of people confuse them, fair enough. So we have tried to not use too many acronyms here. The short answer to the second question is no. So if we go to the next slide, we can look at some of the differences between these 2 standards. So we first published the near-term criteria, as I mentioned, back in 2020. And at that point, the initiative was focused on 5 to 15-year targets, and it was still focused on emission reduction targets. We knew that we didn't want to do total portfolio financed emissions reduction targets for the reasons that we've alluded to earlier. So what we did was we focused on asset class level emission reduction targets, whether it was for electricity generation project finance in terms of the emissions intensity of that electricity generation, or for corporate lending. We focused within the asset class. Now, with this new net zero standard, we've changed the time frame first and foremost. So we've rolled back the time frame for the near-term targets to 5 years total. We've complemented that with long-term targets, which can go out to 2050 at the latest. And the idea here is that 5 years is actionable and has some accountability for the entity setting the target. A second difference is that we have differentiated investing into asset owner versus asset manager investing, and we've also added these 2 additional activity areas of insurance underwriting and capital markets activities. This broader coverage helps us to address a broader range of financial institutions' actual activities to make sure that the targets are meaningful and have large impact. We've also introduced climate alignment as a leading metric, as we've discussed in previous slides. And this new approach is really a major change, as it was explained. And it's most illustrated with the implementation list, where we've listed third-party resources that may be used by financial institutions and other stakeholders to develop and set their targets, and also to define what alignment looks like. This is a major change, and again, it is a leading change for SBTi that we expect to also be reflected in the update for the corporate net zero standard, which is ongoing. Finally, as Jana described, this standard includes requirements for financial institutions to set both fossil fuel and deforestation policies. Originally, the 2020 framework did not include any fossil fuel provisions. When we updated the framework last year, we included a fossil fuel option, which some financial institutions have already used for their science-based targets. With the financial institutions net zero standard, we've built on that earlier work to add full-time requirements. So all financial institutions with net zero targets with us have to set these 2 policies. So these are some of the major changes between the near-term framework and the new net zero standard. Back to you, Pendar.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Nate. So for the next question, I'm going to go to Jana. Do credible transition plans play a role in the standard?
Yes, Pendar, thanks. Good question. And yes, they do is the answer. So the standard highlights the importance of having transition plans and also recommends the development with established best practice frameworks. Because the SBTi acknowledges that transition plans are in fact a powerful way for financial institutions to show how they will align and deliver on their net zero commitment and targets. In practice, financial institutions' climate transition plan should incorporate and substantiate the key elements of the standard, from a net zero commitment to governance, policies and targets, to engagement strategy and progress assessment, while fleshing out how policies and targets would be delivered. Back to you.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Jana. Just staying with you, could you just define how climate solutions are described in the standard, and also if you could give us some examples.
Yeah, happy to, because it's a new add-on to the standard, so it's a good question. So climate solutions are defined as an asset or activity that contributes to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and has a low emissions intensity. Also, climate solutions are compatible with achieving net zero by 2050 and are intended to accelerate the transition towards a net zero carbon economy. In the standard, the SBTi considers an entity to be a climate solution if at least 90% of the company's revenue is aligned with eligible categories of taxonomies that are captured in our implementation list. To your second component, the examples. I'll give you 3 across sectors, and those include 1, the renewable electricity generation or storage of electricity. Number 2, for fossil fuels, it includes projects exclusively dedicated to retrofitting for non-fossil fuel use. And 3, another commonly asked question, if listed in eligible taxonomies, nature-based solutions are also considered part of climate solutions. And good examples are afforestation and restoration efforts. Back to you, Pendar.
Thanks, Anna. I'm going to stay with you and ask the next question. Question 7, does the standards support financial institutions providing transition finance in the emerging markets?
Yeah, so in short, yes, absolutely, it does include that. Nate already gave you 4 examples of regional differentiation of the standard. Let me zoom into climate alignment and give you some more details and examples. So the alignment targets provide a mechanism for increasing transition finance in emerging markets, and the implementation list supports that by identifying eligible categories of certain taxonomies that can be used to evaluate whether financial activities can be considered a climate solution or not. The implementation list itself includes global taxonomies as well as regional taxonomies. Giving you some examples from emerging markets, the implementation list currently includes the taxonomies of Mexico, Rwanda, Thailand, and Sri Lanka. We're looking to increase that over time as the regional taxonomies also progress. Back to you, Pendar.
Thank you very much. Now, Nate, going to you. How interoperable is the standard with regulatory frameworks, for example, the European Sustainability Reporting Standard or ESRS?
Thank you, Pendar. Great question. So I'd say generally it's early days for these standards. And so this is obviously a new standard by SBTi. And as we've designed it to be global. It's not aligned with any particular jurisdiction or set of regulations. And it's intended to be applicable for financial institutions in many different countries. In terms of the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, those, as you know, have been paused for the time being. If and when work on those resumes, we plan to revisit them in terms of interoperability. Likewise with other jurisdictions that are developing related standards and disclosure rules. More generally, it's important to add that while SBTi standards provide the criteria for setting science-based targets, companies and financial institutions are responsible for meeting any national, subnational, and/or regional legislation or regulation that apply where they operate. Back to you, Pendar.
Great. Jana, going to you. Question number 9, how can I propose using other climate-aligned methodologies that aren't listed in the implementation list?
Thanks. So the best starting point for that is the SBTi protocol for usage of third-party methodologies. It has a backward-looking component, so details on how we created the implementation list, but also, and that's to your question, it contains the forward-looking component. So it outlines how additional third-party climate alignment methodologies may be submitted and evaluated, always ensuring they align with the SBTi's quality criteria. It also explains how eligible methods are added to or can be removed. For stakeholders that do have knowledge about third-party methodologies that are not on the list, please fill out the request form that is linked in Annex 1 of the protocol. The implementation list will be curated by the SBTi on an ongoing effort, because we do see that as an important tool to facilitate interoperability in the market. Back to you, Pendar.
Thank you, Anna. And Nate, going to you, if you would succinctly set out what are some of the main challenges and opportunities for financial institutions setting net zero targets.
Thanks, Pendar. Briefly here, mindful that we're out of time. 3 of the key challenges that we see with financial institutions are data quality, coverage, uncertainty, policy uncertainty, and coverage of their activities and assets by the target and the standard. So this standard addresses all 3 of those challenges through the components that we've described here in this webinar. We're happy to circle back. In terms of opportunities, there are numerous opportunities related to energy transition, reducing transition risk, and stabilizing our climate, most importantly of all, that we feel are important for financial institutions to consider as they decide how to address our climate challenges. With that, I will hand it back to you, Pendar, to close us out.
Thank you very much, Nate. So this brings us to the end of the Q&A session. Please note that a recording of this webinar, including the translations, will be available soon on SBTi's YouTube channel in the coming days. You can also find all the resources mentioned in today's presentation on our financial institutions webpage. Please sign up to our mailing list and follow us on social media to receive latest updates. Most importantly, help us spread the word about the standard. If you're part of a financial institution, we invite you to set targets. As we've just heard, doing so will help mitigate your exposure to climate-related transition risks, build resilience, and maintain competitiveness, and gives you the benefit of many business opportunity that it provides. If you would like to get in touch with us, potentially set up a discussion to support your target setting journey, please write to our financial institution's email address that is shared. Please bear with us as we get back to you given the high demand. So thank you very much. All there is left for me to say is a very big thank you to the panelists and to you all for joining us today. Please fill out the post-webinar survey link to the chat to provide feedback and ask any last questions to help us shape the future resources such as the Q&A that we will be publishing. Thank you very much. Goodbye and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.